Hello, welcome to Nikkei Forum. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sonoko Watanabe. I'm your moderator. So today we discuss, today's webinar is a special edition of our Untold Story of Chip War webinar series. And today's title is Global Tech Supply Chains under our new US president. So that means Mr. Donald Trump. So today we discuss how Donald Trump's return as US president is likely to change US semiconductor industry and trade policies, and what those changes mean for the global chip industry and the broader tech supply chain. So today we have very strong panel of experts. So first, let me introduce Mr. Chris Miller, author of global bestseller, Chip War, The Fight for World's Most Critical Technology. So Chris, welcome back for the Nikkei webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you. And today, we have Mr. Yo Han-kyu, a former trade minister for South Korea. Han-kyu is now a senior fellow with the Patterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Today, he joins from Seoul, South Korea. Hello. And of course, we have our own Annie Chen-Ting Fang, Nikkei Asia's Chief Tech Correspondent based in Taipei. Hello, Annie. And so webinar today is a 1-hour webinar, and we will take very brief break, probably around 1.5 minutes, just middle of the session. And this time we have received really numerous questions from the audience. So therefore, most of my questions today are based on the questions you submitted. So here are some varieties of topics we want to discuss today. So it's reflect the audience's questions. So they are interested in, so how Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0 are different, or more tariffs or trade barriers, and what happened to the friendshoring, and what happened to the current US CHIPS Act and other incentives. And also they are interested in the level or development of the China's localization effort. And of course, the impact in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, ASEAN, and other economies in Asia. And of course, the future of supply chain, polarization, and decoupling really happen. And in that case, who gains most? So let's start today's discussion. So the first question is for Chris, order of the chip war. So Chris, we have been observing the ongoing chip war in recent years. So this includes like a new wave of the huge investment in the United States. It's supported by CHIPS Act and China's effort to build their own self-sufficient domestic semiconductor industry and increased demand for AI chips, and along with the US tightening of the US export control on AI chips to China. So the first question to you is, do you think, under the new US administration, the chip war will intensify? Or if so, what will be the focus areas? Like will the chip war 2.0 might be very different from the first chip war? How do you think?
Well, I think the key to answering this question is to start by realizing the U.S. is just one player in a multiplayer conflict. And I think if you were to ask which party was most responsible for setting off the current phase of the chip war, the decision to put lots of government subsidies into the industry, the vision of semiconductors as a strategic commodity, not just a commercial product? The answer is that it's under President Xi in China that the current round of the chip war was set off, with the National Integrated Circuit Investment Fund in 2014 and the really extensive investments that have been set in place. And so I think that's important because it means that whoever the president of the United States is, the structural dynamic of China trying to win a much larger share of the chip industry and trying to domesticate and indigenize its own technological base, that's going to happen regardless of who the US president is. And so I think that basic structural desire of China for more self-sufficiency is going to persist. And then I think that's going to impose costs on all the other countries that are big players in the chip industry, including the United States. And I think what we've seen under President Trump's first term, the current Biden term, is that there's a lot of continuity in the US strategy. The US has deployed government incentives, it's deployed export controls, it's deployed investment restrictions, all with a roughly similar set of aims to retain US technological leadership in the segments where the US is a leader. And to ensure that there is as close to a level playing field as possible, recognizing that this is a segment of the economy where governments intervened very heavily in the first place. And so, given that there was continuity under Trump's first term all the way through Biden's term, I think we should assume a fair degree of continuity into the next administration. So I would expect more incentives, I would expect more export controls, and I would expect more tariffs, which are supported by both parties in the United States.
Oh, so maybe the US with China, maybe this pattern is the same, but might be the more new things. How about, so Hanku, how do you think the chip war will intensify? Because now you are in South Korea, so I believe you have many chances to meet the people in government or business there. Yeah, what they are thinking about this?
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. I think basically I agree with what Chris said, this continuity and the sort of structural kind of dynamics in the chip war sector right now. I think this chip war will continue on the Trump 2.0, but in different way. Especially, from policy perspective, I see sort of uncertainty, anxiety in kind of three key policy areas: industrial policy, trade policy, and then tech export control. So first, industrial policy. Yes, I think as Chris mentioned, the first phase of kind of CHIPS Act. I mean, the U.S. has been successful in bringing huge amount of this fab manufacturing investment into the U.S. But I think now we are entering into the second phase, which is implementation, and I think this implementation phase will really determine the success of this chip, fab manufacturing in the U.S. But still, there are, kind of some issues emerging during the implementation phase, like, qualified workforce issues, electricity visa issues, even cultural issues. So I think, it remains to be seen. Second, I mean, tariff or, trade policy. I think this is an area where we see big, possible big kind of radical changes. I mean, in fact, for the last 30 years, there has been this so-called ITA, Information Technology Agreement, basically eliminating all the tariff in IT sector, including semiconductor. And that has really boosted this, cross-border trade and investment in the semiconductor sector. But if Trump 2.0 really follow through on this tariff, kind of threat that he mentioned during the campaign in the semiconductor sector, I think that will be really disruptive. So I think, basically from the semiconductor, the players' point of view, investing tens of billions of dollars in the U.S. is a massive, risk and, investment. And they look beyond just, 2, 3, 4 year time frame and, even like a decade or so. So I think during this Trump 2.0, if they really impose this tariff, then I think that will really to stabilize this corporate sector and their corporate calculation. So I think from my perspective, the best case scenario is that, I mean, they really shouldn't go ahead with this tariff in the semiconductor sector. But even if they do, in the worst case scenario, I think there needs to be some sort of exception for example, foreign investors who invest in this fab manufacturing in the U.S. And then thirdly, export control. I think we'll discuss it later, so I'll come back.
Yeah, thank you, Hankyu. Yeah, also probably that we will come back to the future of the CHIPS Act later because a lot of audience are quite interested in. So how about Arnie? So you meet people in the semiconductor industry or tech every day, right? So we like to know what now they say, like what is our biggest concern for them. And we believe already people start some kind of preparation for what will come. So how are those tech suppliers started preparation for the shift of the U.S. trade policies?
Yes, I think the biggest concern brought up by the industry are they expect the uncertainties, a constant change of policies, and the potential new tariffs and more export controls that everyone also bring up. But we've already seen some risk mitigation measures from some top US tech companies. For example, Microsoft, HP, Dell already asked suppliers to prepare more components from this month and December so that they can assemble more products in Southeast Asia or elsewhere to be shipped to the US to avoid new tariffs hit once President-elect Trump takes office in January. We also reported that Apple already asked suppliers to prepare more iPhones in India before Trump's victory. Meanwhile, suppliers told us that their US clients now become more serious to move out of China as these companies are reviewing 2025 procurement plans and even already set dates to come to their sites in Southeast Asia to audit the progress next year. So, for example, Microsoft hoped to build as many Xbox and Surface laptops out of China. HP and Dell not only hope their product assembly are out of China, but they also hope their parts supplier can have out of China product productions. Previously, for these components makers, setting a logistics center for transfer in a non-China destination is acceptable. But now supply chain executives say that clients want component production also being shipped. And I'm sharing one story that one executive friend from a Taiwanese electronic component maker told me that one US home appliances client threatened them to prepare out of China capacity by 2025 because they are so worried about Trump could do a 60% tariff hike on China. Otherwise, the client told them that they would directly turn to buy from Japanese suppliers, which are more expensive, but not 60% more expensive.
Yeah. Out of China, yeah, has been the word, but now, yeah, people really are getting serious about, yeah, how the development. So, but also we are not so much sure about what what Trump will do. And so Hankyu, so you had the experience, yeah, to directly the negotiating with the U.S. administration under Mr. Trump's first administration. So you're familiar with Trump 1.0's tech policy. And so also I remember you previously described this as like a big sword, like a big knife. And in contrast, like a Biden administration's policy is like sometimes always regarded as like a small yard, high fence. So that means a policy of the strict control, but with a very narrow focus. And so it's more like the doctors, like a precise, like a scalpel, are more like precise knives. So under the Trump 2.0, do you think those tools of the policy will become like a big sword or more like current, like a scalpel? How do you think?
Yeah. You know, I've gone through, as a practitioner, I've gone through the two administration, the Trump one and then Biden as a, you know, kind of counterpart from the allies. And my experience is that during the Trump one, the rhetoric is very, very harsh and, you know, hawkish. But I think when it comes, they haven't really developed this full, you know, export control regime, for example. So it's like, you know, cutting an apple with a big, you know, sword. You know, I mean, it's a powerful, but sometimes you miss it, and then it's kind of difficult to, you know, try to cut an apple with a big, you know, sword. In the Biden administration, on the other hand, I think they really, I mean, the rhetoric was more measured and kind of a reserve, but when it comes to this substantive export control, they have really developed full scale, very sophisticated export control measures. So I felt like it was, you know, kind of surgeon's, you know, the scalpel. You know, that's why I use this analogy between these two different approach. What will happen during this Trump 2.0? I think it remains to be seen. I think Chris may have some, you know, insight on this, but obviously this kind of a decoupling and kind of this export control really targeting high-tech, cutting-edge technology in China will continue to strengthen. And probably, Trump 2.0 might have learned lessons from this two administration, all this how to execute. And obviously there's a loopholes and circumvention here and there, and how to catch those circumvention as well. So, well, I mean, they may, kind of develop some sort of in-between, kind of a more effective tool, like, maybe kitchen knife or swift knife. But, it remains to be seen.
But usually, like there is often like a very gap between what politicians say, like rhetoric, and what they actually do. But in the case of the probably Trump next administration, that means we need to prepare for both the rhetoric and also the actual action. Yeah, do you think so?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think rhetoric-wise, the Trump, first administration was much harsher than this Biden administration. But I think it's fair to say that in terms of the substance, the Biden administration has been really kind of precise and kind of strong. So I think, probably in Trump 2.0, they might be able to sort of mix these two approach.
Thank you. So maybe the next question is for Chris. Also, both of you mentioned like one thing happened in recent year is U.S. Chips and Science Act, and so a lot of money or subsidies are promised, and some of them are already granted. And yeah, we have a lot of questions from the audience about a future of the Chips Act. And recently, the Biden administration finalized the big, like a 6.6 billion subsidies to Taiwan's SMAC. And but also people are concerned about whether the subsidies which were already planned will be really granted in future, or whether the planned subsidies for foreign companies or non-US companies will be granted. So whether the CHIPS Act itself will survive or not. So how do you expect the future of CHIPS Act or other possible incentives in the United States?
Well, I would say we've certainly heard some Republicans question the CHIPS Act, at least on the campaign trail. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind that the CHIPS Act was passed by Congress in a bipartisan fashion, and it was first discussed during the first Trump administration. And I think that suggests that there's actually a lot of bipartisan support for the legislation. There are now chip plants being funded by the CHIPS Act in states that have both Democratic and Republican senators, which of course is very politically significant in the United States. And my very strong guess will be that many of the deals that are being signed between the U.S. government and different chip companies will be finalized by around the end of this year, so before the current administration ends, which means that they'll be more or less locked in. And so I think that the current pot of funding for the CHIPS Act is pretty clear where it's going to go. Could certain companies fail to meet their milestones and require some renegotiation? It could, but I wouldn't expect any large-scale changes to the framework of the CHIPS Act. I think the question is, will there be another one? Because of course the government has already decided how it's going to spend the $39 billion that was allocated. And if the government wants more money, they need Congress to approve more money. And I would say it's much less certain that Congress is going to approve more money. I think next year, Congress has said it's going to focus on cutting taxes, which means that the budgetary situation will be less amenable to allocating more funds to semiconductor manufacturing. But I think it's also the case that the current grants will take a number of years to be fully implemented. And so it might well make sense to first see how this initial set of grants goes before talking about a CHIPS Act 2.0.
Yeah, some of the probably the way of thinking is so CHIPS Act is more for the incentive, yeah, encourage people to invest in the United States, but also there are the tariffs or other trade barriers which force the companies to invest in the United States. So this is a more like A or B or C situation. do you believe the more like incentives or more tariffs, more barriers?
Well, I think if you listen to what President Trump has said on the campaign trail or watch what he did the last term, he talks a lot about tariffs, but most of the tariffs that he implemented in the first term were against China. And I think most of the tariff threats that he makes now, not exclusively, but most of them are against China as well. The US imports hardly any chips from China. And so no matter how many tariffs you impose on semiconductor imports from China, most of the chips the US imports are from third countries, which are probably unlikely to get tariffed by the new administration. And so I think tariffs will be a threat. They will be imposed vis-a-vis China, but they're probably not going to directly incentivize more chip investments in the United States.
Thank you. So Hankyu, like also the South Korean companies also are promised some of the subsidies by the CHIPS Act. So are there concerns among they, for example, like particularly Samsung and SK Hynix about the future of the CHIPS Act? Yeah, would you expect like any changes in their business plan or investment plan in the United States? But also, it might be that they find some kind of opportunities in the US market. So probably instead of the China. So if those companies want to continue to invest in the United States, what kind of benefit they are expecting under the new Trump administration?
Yeah. First, I don't represent these Korean companies,
Yes.
but obviously, in the Korean news media, public, and the corporate sector, there's anxiety about, this, this president-elect's, the threat or promises about the tariff, even against allies and partners, and also, kind of his known view on, subsidies in general. I mean, for Korean companies, and not just Korean companies, I think Taiwanese companies as well. I think it is fair to say that geopolitics has been one of the key factors, but I think fundamentals are economics. And right now, we know that the cost structure in the US is much higher than Korea or Japan, and there's a lot of the additional support needed in terms of qualified workforce training and et cetera that I mentioned before. So I think, this on their own, this math doesn't really add up. So that's why I think this CHIPS Act and then all this support for R&D, the activities, training, and et cetera, has been really playing a kind of a critical role in kind of filling the gap. So I think if you were kind of continuing the democratic government, Korean companies might have wanted chip 2, chip 3, but as Chris mentioned, this with the Republican party, as well as this 2025 tax cut extension would be one of the top priority for this Trump 2.0. So it'll be less likely that kind of more subsidies or chip 2, 3 could be enacted. So I think what they would need as a sort of incentive. I'm sorry, but also the Korean companies, they haven't really finalized legal contract yet with this Biden administration, and it seems that the progress in Texas is a bit slower than the progress in TSMC, the Arizona plan. So I'm not sure whether they could really kind of finalize all the contract before the power transition. So that's why I think many Korean public are a bit nervous about possible kind of changes. But I think this is kind of the big announcement was made about the subsidies, etc. So I think also the credibility of the U.S. government on the line. So I expect that could kind of continue. But going forward, I think unless there's a kind of this needed help from the U.S. government on this issue that I kind of mentioned, I think the future investment might kind of change.
Yeah. So to increase the government revenue, the tariff is also becoming the very important part, and the Trump stressed the importance of tariffs many times. And actually, earlier this week, he posted some proposal of the new tariff or increased tariff for China and Mexico and Canada. And actually, during his campaign, he implicated his intention to impose 6% tariff for export from China and 10% to 20% more like for everyone. It's including their like partners such as South Korea, Japan, and other economies. So if such so-called like universal baseline tariff policy is implemented, probably the first for Hankyu, do you think so-called like a friend shoring policy under the Biden administration, it's more come to the end? So in that case, do you think the supply chain will be completely like separated? Supply chain for United States or supply chain for China and the other partners? How do you think?
Yes, I think this, this friendshoring is not really a kind of precise term, but even during Trump, Biden administration, that the U.S. policy hasn't really kind of consistent. For example, Nippon Steel, Nippon Steel's acquisition, attempt to acquire this U.S. steel. I mean, it really kind of uncertain right now. And I think how the Trump 2.0 would handle this, the Nippon Steel case, that could be sort of a litmus test. Obviously, the Trump administration wants more and more foreign investment coming in to kind of help rebuilding this supply chain in manufacturing sector. So I think that is another kind of a point that we have to kind of look at. And I think, if this across the board tariff 10, 20% against allies partner, if that really gets through, I think it will be really very negative impact on the friendshoring. And I think this Korea, Japan, and other the allies and partners could really try to mitigate this tariff risk by diversifying their portfolio and even like kind of reversing their course of sort of trying to de-risking from sort of previous China-centered supply chain. So I think the U.S. policymakers need to really understand the geopolitical implication of that, the massive tariff they are kind of talking about. And I think that this tech, especially cutting edge, the supply chain could really continue to bifurcate between the U.S. and China. During the Biden administration, we remember this the Inflation Reduction Act. There was when these countries try to source critical mineral, they are not really allowed to source from China and the foreign entity of concern to get this tax credit from IRA. Also, recently, the Department of Commerce, they announced a new rulemaking proposal to sort of ban import of the hardware and software related to electric vehicle. So I think more and more we see this new trend that the U.S. really trying to cut off all these Chinese contents and parts, as Ting Fang mentioned at the beginning. I think that trend may kind of continue, and also there's a ongoing discussion in terms of rules of origin. So far, this conventional free trade agreement was based on this location-based rules of origin, meaning that Korean, Japanese companies invest in Mexico and export to the U.S. that's made in Mexico, right? But what seems to be being discussed right now in the Trump 2.0 is to really kind of shift towards this nationality-based, meaning that even if the Korean, Japanese companies in Mexico, if they use some of the Chinese content, then I think they kind of catch those Chinese components. So because of this ongoing trend, I think in the Trump 2.0, I think this bifurcation of the supply chain, meaning that if Korean, Japanese, or Taiwanese companies, they try to export to the US market, they need to eliminate or minimize these Chinese parts and contents in their finished product to being exported to the US.
Yeah, thank you, Hankyu. Yeah, Chris, yeah, we have been talking about like our for recent years about the diversification of the investment. Also, we're talking about those like a supply chain is very precisely connected, so a bit difficult to divide. But if like a new Trump administration really put this universal like baseline tariff, in that case, probably the people wonder in the future of the friend shoring. So in that case, do you think that this diversification of the supply chain will continue, or like a polarization of the supply chain really become the reality?
Well, I would guess for a variety of reasons, a universal tariff at a high rate is probably not the most likely outcome. I think the lesson we learned from the first Trump term was that the president used tariff threats pretty liberally and carried through on some of them and not others. And that there were a lot of negotiations along the way. And I think we should expect a lot of negotiations along the way this time. I think that the takeaway from that will be that tariffs are not imposed at nearly the rates that are suggested and not nearly as broadly as suggested. But I think what Hanku was suggesting, I agree with, which is that the more tariff threats we hear about and the more restrictions about rules of origin and about use of Chinese components and software and systems sold in the US, the more that does support this bifurcation. I don't really like the word decoupling because it makes it sound like too dramatic a breaking up, but I think we do increasingly see a bifurcation where companies have to have somewhat separate supply chains or even completely separate supply chains to serve the world's two largest economies. And I think that's a trend that is going to continue. I would hypothesize that most people 5 years ago didn't think bifurcation in autos was a really plausible outcome. And today, bifurcation in autos is a reality. I think it's worth us all thinking through what are the other spheres that could be bifurcated down the road, because I think this trend probably has further to run.
Yeah. The audience also want to hear your like a geopolitical analysis about the new trend, like having that. Yeah, how do you see if we think probably the United States have been balancing like a national security concerns, but with a need for like international cooperation in the semiconductor manufacturing, especially with their partners like such as Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. But do you expect like next Trump administration to continue this quite like difficult balancing act?
I think it will, because it will have no choice but to continue a difficult balancing act. And the balancing may well be difficult. It might be messy, I think, at times. But I think the reality is the international semiconductor supply chain only works thanks to cooperation with Europe and the US and Japan and Taiwan and Korea. That's how the supply chain is structured. And there isn't really an alternative. None of those countries are self-sufficient. None of them will be self-sufficient. So you've got to cooperate. The question is just on what specific terms, and that's where I think there will be a fair amount of debate, just like there has been debate in the past. But I think it's always useful. You can always find a member of Congress in the United States who will say, we're going to produce everything onshore, do it all ourselves. But if you look at their voting records and look at the economic policies that they actually implement, you'll find, I think, a much more nuanced policy than the rhetoric often suggests. And I think that's important to keep in mind when we look at the next administration's economic policies as well.
Yeah, any like how about some companies' views, like a company's planning to how they plan to respond to some possible new tariffs, especially the company in Asia. They anticipated the need. They have to do more investment in the United States, or they really need to need to make some choice between invest in the United States or working with China.
Actually, I think Trump's words are very effective when he just talked about he would impose 25% of tariff on Mexico the first day he takes office, who actually would be impacted if materialized. Actually, that put a lot of pressure on the important AI server and the EV supply chain expansion currently in Mexico. But as I said, Trump's words are quite effective. Major NVIDIA Tesla suppliers like Foxconn and Pegatron, they've already expressed willingness to increase U.S. investment if needed. For example, Foxconn just announced they bought additional land for a factory in Houston of Texas for AI server production a day after Trump's warning. But however, how these suppliers must carefully calculate factors such as labor cost and potential tariffs on imported components from other places to the US for server production to see if it's really cheaper. And then second, I would mention that actually supply chain executives expect chip makers from TSMC to Samsung will face more pressure to move more cutting-edge chip production to the US. In TSMC's case, in the most recent quarter, already 71% of revenue coming from US clients led by Apple and NVIDIA. And recently, TSMC suspend production to multiple Chinese AI chip developers to avoid violating US regulations, for example. So actually, for cutting-edge chip production, it will become more difficult to support Chinese clients look into the future, and the Asia chip makers will have to choose the US side. Third, what we have heard is that many suppliers hope to turn risks into opportunities. Let me share one very small anecdote from a Japanese chip chemical maker. One executive told me that they are expecting higher trade barriers between the US and China under Trump 2.0. So they are planning two-way approach. In China, they are drafting plans to grab market share from the US rivals. They will source materials mainly from China for China production to serve China market. And in the US and Japan, both they have production. They will focus on global markets, and material sourcing will be out of China. And even sensitive information, client information from the US, they won't share with the China team. And the China team won't share the information with the US team. They believe these two supply chain approach will be step one to tackle future disruptions in a more decoupled market looking forward.
Yeah, thank you, Arnie. It is interesting, the case. So probably we will take a very short break, 1 and probably half minutes, and we come back. And after the break, we will talk about more on China, the semiconductor industry. Thank you.
Thanks to you, our valued readers, Nikkei Asia has been able to invest further in delivering independent quality journalism from Asia to the world. From award-winning analysis on the US-China tech decoupling, human rights issues, and China's Belt and Road ambitions, to exclusive interviews with the people in power in Asia, and breaking news from all over the region. Our team of over 1,500 journalists and an ever-growing dedicated newsroom will strive to uncover the stories that other publications miss. Nikkei Asia, the voice of the Asian century.
Welcome back to Nikkei Forum. So the second part, maybe we will discuss more on the China. So the first question is for Annie. So last year we saw a lot of development in China's semiconductor industry. Like one example is Huawei's new smartphone with very advanced semiconductor technology. Yeah, a lot of people are quite surprised and impressed of the development. But how do you assess like a current the development level or like an industrial localization effort of the China, such as like AI chips or other areas?
Yes, I think our supply chain checks indicate that Huawei remains the major driver for China's tech and chip advancement. And also, they are a big user of those tech. They also bet big on R&D for chip equipment and a lot of other materials. They are representing the so-called Team China with strong government support to demonstrate they could survive the US export controls. I believe some parts are the China's propaganda to look better, but in terms of AI chip and platform, Huawei's Ascend platform is still the most competitive domestic solution inside China with about 25% of market share, besides market leader NVIDIA. And those Chinese tech companies blacklisted by the US, for example, SenseTime and iFlyTech, are all training their AI use Huawei's platform. We also heard that government encouraged Chinese companies to use Huawei more and reduce use of NVIDIA if they can. So if talk about China's top chip maker, SMIC, which help Huawei produce AI and smartphone and other chips, it's of course very challenging for them to do 7 nanometer chip in a commercial way, but they demonstrate they could do it with less advanced lithography tool, just the yield is much lower. However, on the mature and the less advanced chips, SMIC or SMIC is doing a very good job in many type of chips, from display driver ICs, microcontrollers, connectivity chips, sensors, power management chips, and for all type of local demand. Their utilization rate is actually even higher, and the recovery is higher, stronger than some of the Taiwanese competitors such as PowerChip or UMC, because as SMIC, they secure China's massive domestic localization demand.
Yeah, SMIC is the China foundry, the based in Shanghai, and they produce the chip for the Huawei. Yeah, but Ani, but is there any big constraints or some challenge for China in development domestic semiconductor industry? It's clear they already chosen to develop their entire supply chain. What is a challenge for them now?
Yes, I would mention briefly about what they've already did, because I think, of course, U.S. export control definitely very effective to block China from using the most advanced chip equipment and production technologies. But we also need to be mindful on the side effects. The U.S. blacklisting gives China a very strong incentive to use their own domestic solutions. I've already mentioned SMIC, and one notable another example is about OLED displays, which only 5 years ago was completely dominated by Samsung. But now Chinese players led by BOE has over 40% of share this year, and also a lot of other examples. And then Watanabe-san, you are asking whether China still have a bottleneck. I think their bottleneck is still the most cutting-edge chip production capacity that TSMC, Samsung, Intel do, and the lithography equipment that ASML offers, as well as most cutting-edge chip materials like photoresist from Japan. These most advanced segments will take them years or decades to come up with their own solutions. I think the gap will still be there in years to come, but they will use all type of creative ways to solve the problem, from stockpiling, from reverse engineering, even some circumvent efforts by foreign subsidiaries from the third nation. And also one reality is more slow is slowing down. So chip developers like NVIDIA is no longer rely on single advanced chip to provide computing performance they need. All the top chip makers are researching on how to link and stack and package different chips to boost computing performance. However, equipment for chip packaging is less advanced than chip manufacturing. So many executives also say that this new avenue of chip packaging actually to boost computing performance will be an opportunity for China to at least close some gap.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Chris, also we like to hear your assessment of the development level of the China semiconductor industry, especially now is some focal area is AI related semiconductor. So how competitive are the products China now can produce? And because we know China need the huge amount of the computing demands, so how China cope to like accommodate this necessity, like energy efficient technology?
Well, I think I agree with everything that Annie said with regards to the chip level of the competition. I think now, in addition to competition over who can produce and acquire the best chips, there's a second level, which is who can string them together in bigger and bigger data centers for training more sophisticated AI systems. And of course, if you want to train an AI system efficiently, you need something pretty close to the cutting edge when it comes to the AI accelerators that are being produced. And the aim of the U.S. restrictions that was put in place 2 years ago was to target, in particular, AI accelerators, the chips that are used in AI training. And I think what we've seen over the past 2 years now, since those restrictions have been in place, are, on the one hand, there have been loopholes. There's been widespread reporting of smuggling, for example, of restricted chips into China. Of course, Huawei is producing some volume of its own GPUs, but we also see that Chinese firms are importing very large volumes of the NVIDIA chips that have been specifically downgraded to be legal to sell to the Chinese market. And you'd only buy downgraded chips if you didn't have a better option. And I think the fact that China is still a major importer of these chips that are downgraded for China suggests that there still is a deficit of computing power domestically that Chinese firms are struggling to overcome. And I think for the next couple of years, I think with a pretty high degree of confidence, we'll be in a similar situation because TSMC will remain meaningfully ahead of SMIC. And so even though I agree with Annie that it's no guarantee that more advanced chip making processes are as important in the future, at least for the next couple of years, we'll be in a situation in which access to TSMC really matters. And if you don't have access to TSMC, you're going to be behind in the amount of computing power you can bring to bear to train AI systems.
Like at this point, like how large is like a gap between the China and the United States in the field of the AI or AI related chip technology?
Well, it's a very hard question to answer because there are multiple ways you could measure it, and different measures will give you different assessments. I think TSMC has said that they've been 5 years ahead of SMIC for the past 15 years. Every year, SMIC improves a bit. Every year, TSMC improves a bit, and the gap remains the same. So at the chip level, 5 years sounds like a roughly right number. But in terms of using chips to train AI systems, the AI field is still very much in the early days. We see a lot of innovation, not just around chips, but on the algorithms that are used in training. It's still not clear what the products are that will be most profitable in AI. And so I think it's actually quite difficult to say what the gap really is. I think there's not much doubt if you had to choose which ecosystem you'd rather be a part of, you'd choose the Silicon Valley ecosystem rather than the Chinese AI ecosystem. If you look at the amount of investment going in, certainly a lot more investment going into the U.S. ecosystem. But there are of course, many thousands of brilliant computer scientists and AI experts in China, and they have access to capital and have access to compute. They're going to do impressive things, and so I think it will be a close race. Even though I think right now, by most metrics, the U.S. Ecosystem would be ahead.
Do you think like the China can create its own AI ecosystem? It might be a bit different from the US AI ecosystem.
Yes.
How do you think?
Well, I think there's no doubt it can create its own ecosystem. The question is it as capable? And will third countries be as interested in paying for it? Right now, if you look at the many parts of the software and consumer internet technology stack, China's got its own ecosystem, but it's really struggled to export its ecosystem. And so, with the exception partially of Southeast Asia, Chinese consumer internet firms and software firms have really struggled internationally, even though they've been very successful domestically. And so I think I would bet heavily on China having its own AI ecosystem. But that to me is not the important question. The important question is, will that ecosystem be as capable and will it be as successful in third countries? And I think right now, although it's very, very early days, I think right now you'd have to judge that US firms are being more successful in third countries than Chinese firms are.
Thank you. The question for the Hankyu, like, so it might be the more probably the export control or some like barriers for China from the United States. But what kind of the countermeasures can China or Chinese government take against the United States and other like economies to protect its own semiconductor industries or tech supply chain? What could they do if the United States become more like fortress United States? Like in that case, where those like goods from the China will go and what will happen in the global economy?
Yeah. I think when we look at how Chinese government could react, I can see kind of on two fronts. Promotion in the domestic front, and kind of protection on the kind of international kind of front. First, I mean, I think I agree with what the assessment that the Chris made. For the next in a short period of time, it's very difficult for China to catch up with the cutting edge equipment, and then the refined chemicals, etc. But I think the Chinese look at it from more long-term perspective. I think a couple of years ago, the President Xi, he kind of publicly mentioned that it takes 10 years to sharpen a perfect sword. So I think they have this more long-term horizon, and then pouring massive amount of government financial resources. They produce more than 2 million engineers every day. And then I visited China a couple of months ago, and I visited some of the AI company and EV companies, and their technological advance was really amazing. Although at a macro level, their economy is kind of slowing down. So I don't think we can underestimate China's potential to really turn this sort of a crisis into sort of Sputnik moment. And then on the international kind of front, I think recently it's noticeable that the Chinese government, they develop sort of new export control with this extraterritorial kind of application. Basically, they kind of copied the U.S. system, and the U.S. has this choke point in the semiconductor technology, but China has choke point in this EV batteries and critical mineral. For example, Korea and Japan rely on China for more than 90% of graphite, for example. So if they are, if China is hit hard in the semiconductor sector, maybe they may try to kind of target this EV battery or this clean energy sector. So I think it's a sort of alarming that this kind of tit for tat in sort of different sectors could really kind of spread in this in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, Chris, audience want to know about something about the US semiconductor industry. And one, the interest is, of course, NVIDIA is a strong company, but also they are interested in the future of the Intel. So if the United States try to protect American companies in semiconductor sector, do you think the performance of the Intel might affect some US government policy about the semiconductor? How do you think?
Well, I would say first, over the last two administrations, there's been a very clear decision made not to preference US companies, but to preference companies investing in the US. And so I think you would struggle to find precedent in US history for such large subsidies being given to non-US companies, but it's happened in the semiconductor sector. And so I would guess that the fact that this policy has persisted over two otherwise very different administrations suggests it will persist in the next Trump administration. And the fact that the Trump administration was the administration that encouraged or pushed TSMC to invest in Arizona in the first place suggests that it's not going to reverse that decision. So yes, does Intel have many friends in Washington? No doubt. Yes, is it significant that Intel, in addition to having its manufacturing, also has its R&D in the US? No doubt. But it's also significant, I think, that TSMC and Samsung have major operations in the US, major customers who are US firms. And I think that will balance any steps that are taken to give a particular aid to Intel.
Thank you. Yeah, we are approaching probably the end of the webinar, but we will still have something to say. And one is about the impact of the other Asian economies. Like a lot of questions from Asian audience, especially the people from like ASEAN countries and India. Like so those countries like such as Vietnam has been attracted a lot of investment in recent years, like some as a result of the China plus one strategy. And also Singapore, Malaysia, or India now try to build their own strong semiconductor industry. And what happened, yeah, if the Trump 2.0, like he took the confrontation policy against China, what kind of the country can benefit from the new policy? How do you think
Well,
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that there's the Trump 2.0 really provide challenges as well opportunities. For example, Vietnam. Vietnam has really emerged as a sort of a connector countries when this US-China trade really kind of decreased, but many countries set up manufacturing base in Vietnam and export to US via Vietnam. So this kind of Mexico, Vietnam is emerging as a connector countries. But because of that, Vietnam is recording massive, trade surplus with United States. So I think, the Vietnam has to really kind of, cope with this possible targeting, in terms of the tariff measures. But also in general, I think this China plus one strategy and also de-risking diversification really provide new opportunities for the Southeast Asian country, namely Singapore, Malaysia, etc. And in the semiconductor industry, also they try to find the niche in this packaging and this the node in the supply chain. And so I think some of these the government are very proactive in putting up very smart policies, like for example, offering this special economy zone with incentive system and worker training, etc. So I think those kind of a government with enacting the smart policies, they can benefit from this.
Thank you. Yeah, same question for Chris. How do you think which country can get some kind of benefit from the new US government policy? And also one more is what the implication of the potential Trump 2.0 policy on Japan, the recent effort to like re-emerge some strong power in the semiconductor industry?
Well, I agree with Hanku that I think for a number of countries in Southeast Asia, there will be a balance. On the one hand, I think the Trump administration will look skeptically on countries that have large trade surpluses with the US, and Vietnam in particular seems to stand out in that regard. But on the other hand, the reason Vietnam does have this large trade surplus is because of the China plus one dynamics that the first Trump administration was encouraging. And so I think there will be benefits as well as challenges for those countries. I think also India is worth watching very carefully. We've seen a number of US brands investing very heavily in India, especially in southern India, smartphones in particular. And it seems to me that if you're looking for a very large workforce that could complement operations in China that you're shifting away from, India is a natural place to look. And I'm always struck by the number of Taiwanese and Korean companies I know operating in India, which seems to me like a good leading indicator as to where the electronics industry is shifting. So I'm watching India very closely as well. I think for Japan, I don't think the Trump administration is going to bring all that much new relative to the Biden administration. I think there will be trade discussions to be had, but during the first Trump term, those trade discussions were relatively straightforward. And I think there's a whole lot that the US and Japan agree on, both in terms of economics and in terms of geopolitics. So I would guess that for Japan, the new Trump administration is not going to be particularly disruptive.
Okay, thank you. Time is running out. So let me ask each participant one final question. So first question is for Hankyu, like how can the business prepare for our new Trump administration to build like a resilient supply chain? Could you share your thought to how to face new president like full emphasize securing deal. Yeah, how people should respond.
Yeah, I think Japan is a leader in this sector. I mean, 1980s, facing this trade conflict with United States, Japanese companies have really transitioned themselves from export-driven to investment-driven. So now I think it's a sort of a for trade America with high tariff and non-tariff measures put up in the United States. So I think that many companies, especially Japanese and Korean and Taiwanese company, they may try to get inside the fortress America to be relatively safe from all these volatile tariff measures. And I think there's kind of three keywords that I want to encourage this private sector and governments to deal with this from 2.0 is that number one, pragmatism. I think really pragmatism will be important. And second, I think they need to really turn this sort of a negative kind of a sum idea into some of the Trump people into really positive, the win-win kind of a dynamic. And lastly, I think deal making. I think it's much better to find the kind of the win-win value proposition and try to kind of find some sort of truth or peace early on.
It is important advice. So any like when considering the semiconductor industry policy for the new Trump administration, do you have any specific like a date or events you needed to watch? Like, and so what time frame are you considering?
Yes, actually, first I will mention December 1st. China is going to implement export control on multiple high-end metals, material and equipment meet certain specifications. That this include like tungsten, graphite, magnesium, titanium, and aluminum alloys, which China, a lot of them, like controls majority of a global production. For example, tungsten, natural graphite, and magnesium. So whether the chip war will become a raw material war and how that affect the price and sourcing remain something need to be looked into. And second, January 20th, after Trump really becomes the president, what are some first waves of policies he will put into place? Also around the February 10th week, TSMC will host its board of director meetings actually in the US this time, as it's about the time they will enter mass production of their first plant in the US in 20 years. It's discussed in the supply chain whether it will also host an event in Arizona to invite more people to look at their plans and how that move shaped Trump's view on Taiwan's chip industry and Asia's chip industry. After all, TSMC announced this plan under Trump 1.0 in 2020.
So at this moment, the TSMC plant in Arizona start operation 2025.
They say that they now is in a ramp up position. So basically, since the mid of this year, it's going to be on track, and then they will be a mass production around early 2025. That's something we expect.
Yeah, thank you. So the last question for the Chris is, so you are basically a historian. So how do you expect the future of the chip war to evolve over the next 4 years? That means this time's Trump administration term and probably next 10 years. Like, can you share some of the important keywords or key maybe the materials with our audience?
Well, I think there will be two key drivers that will shape how the chip competition will develop. I think the first is going to be technological. How does the industry change? How does chip technology change? I think many people 5 years ago would have been surprised at the centrality of artificial intelligence in the chip competition today, and yet that's where political leaders as well as industry leaders are focused. And it's impossible to predict how technology will shift, but I think it's worth tracking very closely because it will be a key factor in the chip war. And the second is geopolitics. The US-China relationship has, of course, been becoming more tense over the last several years. The China-Taiwan relationship has becoming more tense over the past several years, but over a 10-year time horizon, that could look different. I don't I don't have great optimism, but it's also very hard to predict over 10 years. And so I think the future of the relationship between China and other key players in the chip industry will be a pivotal factor. And where we stand in 2034 when it comes to those political questions is, of course, very difficult to know. But the interaction of, I think, of the technological change with the geopolitical shifts will be the key to the future of the chip war.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm really sorry to say, but time is beeping up. So to follow the latest news on the semiconductor industry and tech supply chain, please check Nikkei Asia newsletter that you will receive on your daily basis. And the archive of today's webinar will be available from December 5th, quite soon. And please take a few moments to complete our survey from QR code, which will appear after this webinar. Your voice are very important for us to improving the quality of the webinar. So thank you, panelists, and thank you, the audience, for your kind participation. We will now close the webinar for today. Goodbye and see you again. Thank you so much.